The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's event, and we're very glad and appreciate your support as a partner in the defense of our great nation. We've got a great lineup for you today. Joining us today to discuss their books are Nancy Collins, author of Gray Wars, A Contemporary History of U.S. Special Operations, Jessica Donati, author of Eagle Down, The Last Special Forces Fighting the Forever War, and Dr. Tony Brooks, author of Leave No Man Behind, the untold story of the Rangers' unrelenting search for Marcus Luttrell, the Navy SEAL lone survivor in Afghanistan. Also joining us today is Lieutenant General Darcy Rogers, U.S. Army retired, a senior fellow here at AUSA, and a career Special Forces officer who will moderate the discussion. For those of you joining us online today, please take advantage of having these authors here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion with the authors, General Rogers and the panel will take as many questions as time allows. And finally, you can find a full bio for each author and our moderator in the Handouts tab, which is also on the right side of your screen. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to General Rogers, who will tell us a bit more about our guests. Darcy, over to you, sir.
And I'll introduce our thought leaders for today. Dr. Collins is the Chair of Defense and Security Studies at Columbia University. She's also a senior fellow at the Modern Warfare Institute at West Point. Since 2010, she has served as a senior advisor or strategic consultant for occasional special projects for the U.S. Department of Defense. Ms. Jessica Donati covers foreign affairs for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C., has reported from over a dozen countries in that role. She joined the paper as a bureau chief in Kabul in 2015. Her work reporting in the war in Libya was chosen as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 2012. And joining us remotely, Dr. Tony Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a retired member of the elite 75th Army Ranger Regiment. He deployed to Afghanistan in 2005 and Iraq in 2006 and 2007. He was part of the primary combat search and rescue team for a downed MH-47 Turbine 33 during Operation Red Wings 2 in Afghanistan, and he served in the Battle of Ramadi in Iraq. Dr. Collins, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, General Swan. Thank you, General Rogers. It's a privilege to be your guest at AUSA. I look forward to today's conversation about U.S. Special Operations Forces with the AUSA community. I've been asked to provide some opening remarks on my book, Gray Wars, with Yale University Press to kick off this discussion, and I'm pleased to do that. The objective of Gray Wars is twofold. The first is to offer a contemporary history of U.S. Special Operations Forces to include its missions, cultures, structures, and methods, as well as to analyze its defining moments. Part of this narrative is how and why these forces have become a tool of choice for our nation, particularly in the era since hijacked planes became domestic missiles on September 11th, and how this use and these national options have changed over time. This work looks at how these units have undertaken select military activities, frequently high-risk missions of a sensitive nature, working in small teams, solving unconventional problems, and delivering asymmetric effects. The second objective is to pose a question to all of us. to ask about our nation's present and future security priorities. Today's gray wars, fights that are neither hot wars nor cold peace, are our nation's operating environment. Around the world today are a wide range of conflicts, fights of interest, resources, production, access, placements, among many others, far beyond the borders of Afghanistan and Iraq, splintered across 6 continents, vast oceans, low Earth orbits, and the exponential connectivity of zeros, ones, and qubits. And yet, America has been displaying strategic uncertainty. Stay too long here in this place, and these fights will be decided by others and not in America's favor. The question then that I would pose to all of us is, how much of a leap forward are we going to make and take? As a country, are we prepared to advance with resolve, to strengthen our global footprint, to create dilemmas and impose costs on our adversaries, to identify new strategic investments, and to come together in common values in this time of gray wars? Strategic commonality has been, currently is, and will be an enduring requirement for the nation and our nation's forces to be impactful and consequential. I very much look forward to today's discussion. Ms. Donati.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to our hosts for having us here today and to everybody who's joining in remotely. It's a shame that we don't have a chance to meet in person, but I hope that going forward, this will be an option. I'd like to talk a little bit about why I wrote my book. I never set out to be an author, or I never imagined myself even writing a book. But after 4 years in Afghanistan as a journalist there, I started out with Reuters, and then I moved on to the Wall Street Journal. I became really frustrated with the fact that we were not really telling the whole story, and that's because there was very limited access to US operations, and the messaging coming out of Washington was that the war was over, that it was simply a training operation. And what we could see from the ground was that the US military had a really key role in keeping the country together, but it was very hard to say exactly how that was. And I watched things deteriorate over the years that I was there, from 2012 and 13. I lived there to 2017. It ended with a huge bomb going off in the diplomatic area, destroyed neighboring buildings, damaged our office. I was really angry. And that is what prompted me in the end to accept an offer to write a book. And I wanted to understand where to begin with finding out how exactly to tell the story of what the US was doing. And the central part of my book is the bombing of the MSF hospital, which took place during a really key operation, which was the first time the US military intervened on the ground to save an Afghan city that had been captured by the Taliban. And I was able to track down these soldiers and convince them to take part in telling their story. And over the years, I got to know more and more people, and eventually pieced together, as best I could, a portrait of how US Special Operations, starting with Green Berets on the ground, supported by Air Force and other units, were able to keep a lid on the Afghan war. The messaging that continued to come out of Washington throughout this time politically was that the US was no longer in a war footing, and that the cost of these lives was minimal compared to what could happen if the US left. And one of the reasons that I zoomed in on characters in this book was because I wanted to show that even 1 life, 10 lives, 20 lives, when they're lost in this way, really matters, because the policies did not match the situation that soldiers were finding on the ground. And so this is why I wrote the book. I hope that it helps leaders think more about the dangers that they put people in and whether they have the resources that they need to fight and what their long-term objectives are. Because unfortunately, as we've seen in Afghanistan, the moment you remove the support that those soldiers were providing, the country collapsed. It didn't even last long enough for the last soldiers to leave. And so I think all of the people who served there will be wondering about the sacrifices that were made and what the long-term plan was. So I hope this is helpful to inform that debate. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hello, I'm out here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest today, and I just wanted to say thank you for having me. I'm not really one to fit into this crowd with Ms. Donati and Dr. Collins. They are the ultimate professionals, so thank you for having me. A lot of us, have heard the term, the pen is mightier than the sword, right? And I think Ms. Donati and Dr. Collins clearly espouse that. Well, I'm an Army Ranger, so a pen doesn't mean that much to me unless it has one of these. And as you can see, I've got a little blade on my pen there. So the pen is mightier than the sword sometimes. So my book, Leave No Man Behind, the pictures you're seeing on the screen are myself and my roommate, and in front of an MH-47. And that particular MH-47 was the one that ultimately we ended up recovering less than a month after that photo. I was involved in at the time, it was the largest loss of life in special operations history. And that was Operation Red Wings. Now, a lot of people on this webinar, people tuning in, have probably either seen the movie The Lone Survivor or heard of the movie The Lone Survivor with Mark Wahlberg. Well, that event was my very first mission as a U.S. Army Ranger. I had arrived at 2nd Ranger Battalion in 2004. I trained for 6 months to deploy to Afghanistan on my very first deployment. And it was a very slow time, very slow for special operations at the time. We kind of were underutilized at the moment. The war had shifted and we were bored. We weren't doing much. So the fact that, I ended up on my first mission during Operation Red Wings is something new to anyone, but I was the closest thing to a civilian in the special operations community. So that's why I ended up writing my book. One, the story needed to be told. History dies with our veterans every day because a lot of us will hold on to our stories. This story in particular, I never told my own family. It's a story it's a wartime setting, but it's a story about the soldiers and the special operators preparing for war and the camaraderie, the courage it takes to step out of your comfort zone, knowing that one of the most tragic events you will ever experience is what you're headed into. You're seeing some of the terrain that we walked on the screen currently. And I just wanted to say that my book, although I wrote it for my children, I wrote it for my fellow comrades and military members. It tells a story of unity. It tells a story of mission beyond self. And I think that's the big mission of my book. And I really hope you guys all enjoy it when you do get a chance to read it. It's definitely a different perspective on war. So with that, thank you for having me, and I'll pass it back to General Rogers.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. And now we'll allow our thought leaders to answer your questions. And we'll start out with the first question, which is, has the pendulum swung too far to the direct action model and counterterrorism role for soft forces? And have our soft forces lost their unconventional warfare skills their training of indigenous forces skills and guerrilla warfare skills. That'll be a toss up here, or
You can start. Want me to start? Okay,
okay.
sure. I would offer that there's a rebalancing already taking place. That there is a recognition by policymakers and military leaders that there was perhaps an overemphasis on some of counterterrorism operations and actions, and that there was a need to change that balance.
Mhm.
So over the last year to two, there have been significant changes that have brought about greater investments in the indigenous approach, in other types of activities that don't fall under the traditional CT model that we saw dominant, particularly between 2001 and 2018. I anticipate that over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to continue to see that rebalancing taking place.
Is that rebalancing, just to go off this a little bit, is that rebalancing focus coming from SOCOM headquarters down through the forces, or do we see that directed from our policymakers?
I think it's broader than within SOCOM and the community itself. From congressional leaders, from White House, Pentagon, and GCC leaders, I think there's a broader recognition of this need of change, so that it includes SOCOM leadership and soft leadership, but it is not exclusive to them.
It'll be interesting to see how long it takes to evolve that, because our policymakers have become very comfortable with the quick results of the Red X counterterrorism mission. So it's going to take some adjustments, I think, at all levels to fully embrace unconventional warfare, indigenous training capabilities, et cetera. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nadi.
Yeah, one of the things that I saw in Afghanistan was that a lot of the special forces built up a lot of knowledge about the ground, but they didn't really have the kind of systematic training that would have probably benefited them. And more generally, the US military, they didn't have language training, even though they would go back 5, 6 rotations. And there was sort of haphazard where they would end up. And so from my perspective, I don't think that there is that kind of long-term investment that you're talking about in language training and in those other skills. I think that increasingly, especially as the news cycle is so short-term focused, that there's just not a lot of political appetite to go into to make these big investments. And I think direct action is a kind of easy, if it goes wrong, you might have a day of bad news, but that's it. And it's politically less risky. And so from my perspective, looking at Afghanistan, I don't see a big change.
Okay. Dr. Brooks, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is a little bit different coming from the 75th Ranger Regiment. That unit has evolved greatly into very much a counterterrorism force and urban warfare. And I think what the military is doing is they are really honing individual skills, whereas unconventional is your SF. You got your counterterrorism, which you got Navy SEALs, you've got the Army Rangers, really focusing on those tasks. So I think it's really compartmentalizing the soft forces into different groups, is the way I see it.
Thanks. And that really ties into our next question here is, what role should special operations forces play in the era of great power competition? We just talked about, the indigenous training, unconventional warfare, et cetera. How do we now scope special operations forces to compete with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea?
I mean, I could start by saying that the approach that other powers have, it's a lot more than just military. If you look at how Russia uses Wagner Group, there's a certain element of deniability, but it's a private force. What I saw from, again, seeing these other powers in Afghanistan, their people tended to be a lot more focused on the particular issue. So, for example, the diplomats that would go there would speak Farsi and Pashto fluently, did their own press conferences with the Afghans, and so they invested a lot more research, a lot more effort in all of these different things. And as things stand, I don't know that continuing with this model is going to be able to compete with the kind of private investments that Russia and China use in these areas, and the effort they do diplomatically as well.
Okay. Dr. Collins?
Yeah, I would perhaps add that the special operations forces, given the scale and flexibility and adaptability of these teams, provides approaches and methods within what some term a great power competition. So, for example, creating windows of opportunity for the joint forces to come in and take impactful action is one of the ways in which SOF provides value. I would offer too that that there isn't perhaps as much separation between what special operations forces and general purpose forces and the broader intelligence community do than there might have been at one point in time. That it's a fairly coordinated approaches and methods. So I don't see it perhaps as separated as the question might suggest.
Okay. Dr. Brooks, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, again, coming from the 75th Ranger Regiment, I've watched that unit evolve rapidly over the past 2 decades from a more conventional style airfield seizure unit to a modern, urban warfare counterterrorism group. And what I've seen is the investment in the SOF community has, obviously it's expanded. So I do think we might be a little heavy on special operations, but there are areas of the SOF community that are competing with China and Russia in the metaverse, so to speak. And I think that's, along with urban warfare, I think that's where we're invested at this point.
Thanks, Dr. Brooks. We've got a follow-on question that I think is really important here. So even though the priorities may be rebalancing from direct action, counterterrorism, countering violent extremists, and we work towards unconventional warfare and other SOF capabilities, is there concern that the current generation of SOF leadership was selected, bred, and trained for their DA, direct action, counterterrorism, countering violent extremist prowesses? Does RSOF have the leaders it needs to effectively engage in this great power competition? I'll turn it over to you, Nancy.
Sure. Yes, I think that current Army Special Operations Forces leadership has demonstrated the skills, the talents, the ideas, the approaches that are required for today's fight. Yes, it is. I would concur. It's accurate that many of them came of age in a predominantly CT fight. And I would offer that is a skill that's especially well honed. I think that's pretty factual. But I don't think it's interfering with approaches that are more unconventional, more asymmetric, more indigenous in nature. So I don't see them as a dichotomy or somehow in conflict with each other. I think there's a recognition, and I know that a number of Army Special Operations leaders have spoken to this in other contexts. I think there's a recognition that a greater investment needs to be made in non-CT, non-VEO areas. So I think that it's moving to where it needs to be. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Brooks, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very similar to prior questions. I think that we've kind of covered some of this, but the beauty of the special operations community is it's very adaptable. You have guys, I mean, my first training in special operations was on Vietnam era patrol bases. And then the global war on terror was going on. So we quickly learned that, that kind of training is useful, but not modern. So we used that to our advantage and quickly trained up for urban warfare, quickly trained up for indigenous training. You just look at how quickly those forces have adapted over the past 2 decades, and I have no doubt in my mind that it will continue to adapt to more modern enemies.
Mr. Nutty?
I would only add that there is this effort to reorient towards great power competition and something new, but I wonder to what extent the US may not be dragged back into some of the same battles we've been seeing, because as you see, the situation in Afghanistan is not resolved. You have Iraq and Syria, um, which are in precarious situation. Then you have emerging CT issues in Africa as well, which are very overlooked. And so I wonder whether going forward these skills will not be needed.
Okay, thank you. Now I think we'll shift just a bit here about the challenges that goes along with writing about special operations forces. So how did you, for each of you, how did you convince um, both special operators and perhaps, Mr. Nadi, in your case, your Afghan partners, to share their stories and allow you to write these books? And we can start with you, if we could.
I mean, I think one of the reasons that a journalist is able to get into these communities and report on some of these very difficult and sensitive operations in Afghanistan is because there was a sense of frustration that the reality that they were experiencing in Afghanistan did not at all match the rhetoric in Washington or the policies that were being devised for them on the ground. And I think that gap created an opening for some of these people to explain the challenges that they were receiving in the hope that if these came out into the public, they would be addressed. I mean, if we look back at a lot of the journalism that was done over the years from 2015 onwards, when the Obama administration officially turned the war into a training operation, there was no reporting about what the US operations were, even though the US was increasingly taking an active role going into cities and villages alongside Afghan commanders. And they lacked really key equipment, like as you would read in the book, like working vehicles and air support, and means to get supplies dropped to them, really basic stuff. And so I think that this frustration gave me an opportunity. And the other, the other aspect of it is that with everybody that I worked with, I gave them assurances of to be anonymous unless they chose not to be. Everyone who was a main character in the book got a chance to read it before it went out and to make any suggestions for corrections and anything. And I think that kind of safety and building up these relationships over the years helped, because for many of the soldiers, I knew them for years before the book came out.
Good. Dr. Collins?
Yeah, I think in the first instance, it was just a process of being totally transparent and upfront with everyone that I was speaking with, that I was engaged in a work of scholarship, that I was interested in accuracy, and that was the objective and that was the goal. And then secondly, at the time that I decided to focus my research in this area, there was a growing mythology about special operations and special operations forces that was getting farther away from accuracy and reality. So I think that there was a certain perhaps appetite or willingness to have the conversation, but because what was being spilled on various pages or what was being spoken on various networks and other outlets was pretty distant from a number of people's experiences. And then the third part, I guess, is maybe a process aspect to it, which is that I did officially sign documentation that I wanted to have all that I wrote be reviewed by pre-publication Department of Defense prior to Yale publishing the book, to ensure that I had not enclosed or disclosed anything that was not to be included. So I actively sought that out. I wasn't interested in having disclosures that would inadvertently be in there and that would harm national security interests. So that's part of the process that I went through. As it turned out, that's quite a lengthy process. It ended up not staying within the Department of Defense. It ended up going to 23 different agencies and departments. And I got all the markings back. And I was actually quite grateful for the careful reading that I had from a number of national security professionals who flagged questions, which actually allowed me to provide clarifying remarks. So there wasn't any inadvertent disclosure, but there were portions of the monograph that professionals flagged as, it's not clear to me here when you speak about this, are you referring to this or that? And so I was able to, I think, ultimately produce a better work of scholarship in light of that, in light of that process. But it's a different process than journalism. You know, in Ms. Donati's world, the scholarship is really intended to be sort of a long durée, if you will. So something that could be picked up 10, 20, 30 years from now and would have, you know, lots of dry footnotes and dry text that, you know, future folks might be able to delve into this research and take it further than I was able to sketch out in this book.
Right. Thank you. And Dr. Brooks, yours is a bit different. You've got more of a war story perspective. We'd like your thoughts.
Yeah, so obviously, you know, being in the special operations community, I had to go through the whole DoD approval process as well. And it is quite lengthy. Another thing is special operators in general, we don't really like writing books. We don't like telling our stories. So getting all of my friends and colleagues to be okay with me telling our story was a challenge. And ultimately, like Ms. Donati was saying, is there was a big frustration amongst my colleagues that our story had never been told correctly. You know, we were competing with Hollywood, and someone had to tell the story from our perspective. And so it was very empowering for a lot of the guys that were out there that really their families didn't even know that they were involved because they didn't want to compete with Hollywood. So it was a very, very different challenge for me.
Great, thanks. Our next question is, we hear much about the personal toll that the pace of operations has taken on our soft forces and operators. Have any of you seen this in your research, and can you comment on it?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the, I think one of the reasons, again, that people did want to speak was because they had been worn down by all of these back-to-back deployments, and also, I mean, their families were carrying the burden alone to a certain extent. And I mean, one of the problems that I saw in the community was that the community was quite isolated from the rest of the civilian population. The war was being fought by a really small fraction of the nation, and the costs were being borne by these people alone. And so I would hear stories from widows, you know, who would say, "Hi, I'm a widow, and whether they were boarding a plane or something," and people would ask, "What war?" because they weren't aware that there was still a war going on. And so I think that loneliness also takes a certain toll. But I mean, no doubt the fact that the same forces were deployed there over and over again wore them down.
I saw a wide range. I mean, special operators are double volunteers. So they're often, this is what they're choosing. This is what they're seeking. This is their profession. So they're not doing it unwillingly. They're doing it because this is what they care about, and this is what they want to dedicate and devote their lives to. That said, at times, just because one is extremely willing warrior doesn't mean that it doesn't have effects. And sometimes those effects are not immediately obvious. They sometimes come later, sometimes years later, particularly among those who perhaps felt that their activities and efforts did not have strategic impact. A different way of saying that would be that they were had exceptional tactical successes, and yet maybe wasn't as enduring because it wasn't deeply connected to overall strategy.
Mhm.
So I think that that caused frustrations and wear and tear.
Sure. Dr. Brooks, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say the soft community has struggled greatly, mostly in the shadows, mostly by themselves. I see and hear from a lot of fellow soft veterans, and they struggle with, coming back from war. They fought for, some of them fought for almost 20 years, every 6 months deploying overseas. And to me, that's not sustainable. Yet we ask a very small percentage of the population to do it over and over and over again. And a lot of, like Ms. Donati, you hit it out of the park. Very disconnected from society, as most people didn't even realize we're at war. I'm a healthcare provider, so I see a wide range of people, and I would venture to say that most 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, if you ask them what they thought of the global war on terror, they would probably stare right through you. They know what was going on, but they didn't know what was going on, because it was the only time we heard about it in the news was when we failed. And I think that's one of the struggles that the soft community has had, is we only hear about our failures. So that's my perspective.
Thanks, Dr. Brooks. Our next question is, going forward, as SOF continues to evolve and to meet the challenges of great power competition beyond the focus of the last years of direct action and counterterrorism, does this mean that our senior leaders, our Department of Defense officials, are more likely to utilize SOF to solve military problems, or perhaps even overutilize SOF to solve military problems, as has been the case sometimes in the past? So I will turn it over to, we'll start with you, Dr. Collins.
Sure. Yes, I agree that SOF has been heavily used and a go-to for senior policy makers, especially since 2001, and rather continuously. 70s, 80s, and 90s, not so much. Some, but not so much. Now 2 decades, yes, pretty continuously. Here at the end of 2021, I don't anticipate, I don't observe a pattern of shift or change in that. Special operations forces are extremely appealing to senior leaders. They provide a speed of response that other parts of the national security enterprise don't offer. They provide an adaptability and a scale that is appealing. So I don't yet perceive something that would change at this point that type of employment and deployment. Where I think there has been change over the last year to two is that there is greater utility of general forces as well. So an increased utility there. In other words, special operators staying at about the same levels and degrees of employment and deployment, and increased use of other parts of our armed forces alongside and more closely coordinated.
Okay. Mr. Nani?
Yeah, I think this has come up as well in earlier points. Just to repeat it, that I mean, the fact that they're low profile and often deniable, it's a very good way for leaders to respond to challenges without the risk of a political backlash. relatively low investment and low risk. So I think it's going to continue.
Dr. Brooks, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree that it's going to continue. It's politically easy. You've got the most willing people on the planet. They'll go in and get out surgically, and there's going to be very little political backlash. Your chances of failing are pretty slim when you send in some of the more elite units. And I do think that's actually dangerous. I think there's also value strategically in using conventional forces, psychologically. I mean, you bring an entire division of infantrymen in anywhere in the world, and I think that sends a pretty clear message. Whereas you send in a counterterrorism task force, and no one knows about it. So, yeah, I see this continuing probably for at least the next decade, unfortunately.
All right, and for what I think will probably be our last question, this is from a former SF veteran from Vietnam. And the question is, given the necessity for personal credibility when dealing with indigenous forces and training those forces so they trust you and rely on your training, how can that credibility be established given our history of leaving allies behind and recently demonstrated, from current events? So obviously the trust and bond that the special operator must have with the indigenous forces is critical. And you've all seen this in your works. I'd like your thoughts, and we'll start with you, Ms. Donati.
This is a really good question. It comes up a lot, and there's a lot of frustration amongst special forces who go into these situations and are really genuinely, emotionally, passionately committed to their allies, and they're heartbroken when they leave them behind. There's two things. One of them is that local forces will continue to ally themselves with the U.S. for their own convenience, because even if they know the U.S. is short term, they see potential long-term gains that they can have by partnering with the U.S. So I think a certain element of self-interest will always, get some sort of local support, even though they're likely to be skeptical looking at the history of it. The other thing that I would say, which has been interesting to me doing reporting at the Wall Street Journal on the collapse of Afghanistan, is that many of the Afghan government, they didn't believe the US would really leave, despite the signals that were coming out for years through the Trump administration and early in the Biden administration. Some of the Afghan president's top aides didn't believe the US was really going until the last minute. And so I think that to a certain extent, local allies may let hope get in the way of them, and the US could take advantage of that.
Dr. Collins.
Yeah, I think this question goes to the heart of the matter. I think it's exceptionally important question. The strategic fumbles of the last 5 years, I would offer, have been highly costly for the nation, for the nation's investments, for the nation's security, for our citizens. I think it's been an unfortunate moving away from a global footprint, from a global access, and I think it has gone to the heart of our credibility, or it has diminished our national credibility. It has also made the work of our armed services, to include our special operators, that much harder. So it's become more difficult to engage in counter VEO fights. It has become, quite frankly, for the taxpayer, more expensive. If you are trying to engage in operations from a couple of thousand miles away rather than 10 miles away, there's a whole bunch of negative implications of that. For the taxpayer, the dollar; for the policy maker, the strategic effect is more difficult to achieve. For those who are trying to carry out the work in the middle, it's become more complicated. So I would offer that over the last 5 years, strategically, we have had a number of self-inflicted wounds that we are continuing to inflict on ourselves until we can, to be overly blunt about it, get our act back together and move forward with some sort of national security strategy and appropriate campaigning out of that, we will be weakened for it.
Dr. Brooks, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree that we're basically sitting back licking our wounds at this point, and it's going to take years to rebuild our reputation around the world, and it's going to take leaders in the military to be much more diligent in operational planning, because when they're deployed to conduct a mission, it's more than just the mission at hand. We're looking at the world is watching us now. We've blundered multiple times over, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we need to kind of consolidate and earn the trust back of the world.
Well, thanks to all our thought leaders here today, the three authors that joined us, and General Swan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for a great discussion. I think we talked a little bit less about your books and more about the future of special operations, and that's probably very timely, because I think we're all thinking about the future as we transition from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to this era of great power competition. So thank you for your thoughts, and General Rogers, thank you for taking everybody's questions. Before we depart this afternoon, I wanted to inform you about some great upcoming AUSA events. Next Monday, the 13th of December, we will host our final noon report right here at AUSA, featuring Command Sergeant Major Andrew Lombardo, who's the 14th Command Sergeant Major of the Army Reserve. This will be our last noon report for 2021 before we start our new series in 2022. Well, don't forget the AUSA Global Force Symposium and Exposition that'll be back in person from 29 to 31 March in Huntsville, Alabama. We're very excited to be back in Huntsville, Redstone Arsenal community, which has been a great host for this important professional development forum for many, many years. Looking forward to that. And finally, AUSA's annual Land Pack Symposium and Exposition will also be in person once again, 17 to 19 May 2022 in Honolulu, Hawaii. We have some really great events, not just these, but many others, and we hope you can join us for an upcoming seminar or symposium or webinar. If you want more information on any of these events or to register, please visit AUSA's website at ausa.org. And finally, we want to thank all of you who are members of AUSA. Frankly, we can't do what we do for the United States Army, our service members, civilians, and their families without your membership. So thank you for joining us. And if you have not yet joined, please go to ausa.org for more information. And last but not least, many of you know that this Saturday is the annual Army-Navy game. And let me just close out by saying, I know how this one is going to go. Go Army, beat Navy. Have a great Army Day.